Some people absolutely hate classic philosophy or classic literature, and I think it's important that we understand why. Because sometimes they give incredibly astute critiques of the contents of these classics, and at other times, they may help us understand where we might be misunderstanding some of the books that we read. So, fresh from Goodreads, here are some one-star reviews of some of the most influential philosophy and literature of all time. I hope you enjoy. Right, here we have a review of Dostoevsky's magnum opus, The Brothers Karamazov, and it reads, I know it makes me look ignorant and uncouth to declare a masterpiece of literature by one of the greats to be awful, but here I am. I've wanted to read The Brothers Karamazov for years and years. I was looking forward to the type of revelatory experience I had with Anna Karenina a few years back. The, oh wow, now I see what everyone was talking about with Tolstoy is awesome experience. But no, I managed to wade through the first quarter or so of the audiobook before the library demanded it back for another patron, and I can't say I was sorry to see it go. Although, admittedly, it was right as I was starting on the story of the Grand Inquisitor, which is supposed to be the great contribution of the novel, so perhaps I ought to give it a few more chapters. I think this review speaks to a shared experience that many people have reading the Brothers Karamazov, which is that nothing really happens for 300 to 400 pages. The main event of the novel doesn't occur until, I think, page 500 or 600, around that area. And it's a lot of being introduced to people, dithering around in monasteries, having conversations over drinks, and mainly people talking and mainly people walking. And I love that kind of thing. I absolutely love it in films or in TV shows or in books when most of it is taken up by just people chatting to one another, because it gives you a chance to explore each character's worldview. And indeed, that is how Dostoevsky uses this time to great effect in The Brothers Karamazov. You get a really detailed introduction to what each brother thinks and how each brother approaches life. You get active demonstrations of Dmitri's passion and his sensuality and his particular weaknesses and his flaws, right? He gets carried away. One of the first scenes you see of him is him flying into anger. For Ivan, you get a flavor of what his intellectual background is and what he is seeking in his inquiries. He gets introduced as an atheist. You find out that he is staying at Fyodor Pavlovich's house and that he has taken up this sort of influential position over Smizhikov, who is Fyodor Pavlovich's supposed illegitimate son and living in Fyodor Pavlovich's household. You also get introduced to Alyosha, the more spiritual brother, and you get a sort of potted life story of each. But I do really sympathize where this review is coming from. Funnily enough, I recommended The Brothers Karamazov to a very dear friend of mine, and after a while of having it, he called me up and he said, Joe, does anything happen in this book? Like, I'm at page 350, and so far, nothing really's gone on. And I was like, no, stick with it. There is absolutely stuff in it. You just need to persevere through all of this initial slow start. Though I would say the slow start itself contains a lot of quite fascinating philosophy. You really get an insight into Dostoevsky's own views, particularly on Russian society, because you get a kind of gloss of the place of the monastery and the place of the elders and the priesthood in the society that Dostoevsky is living in and writing in. It's also interesting that this review identifies the Grand Inquisitor as kind of the main point of the novel. I'm not sure that I would agree, but I do think the Grand Inquisitor sets up many of the theological issues that are addressed to a certain extent later in the novel, like the tension between happiness and freedom, and whether you can live in a world without God, or whether the idea of God has become more important than God or Christ's message itself. Again, fascinating stuff, but yeah, I'm kind of broadly on board with where this person's coming from, even if I respectfully disagree. The second review of The Brothers K that I wanted to touch upon is this one, and it reads, This book temporarily killed my love of reading and sent me spiraling into a reading slump that lasted 2 months. I finished parts 1 and 2, then I put it on hold until I could muster up the courage to pick it up again about 4 months later. Then I wanted to finish it by the end of 2018 and failed. These characters are such high school drama. They're storming with jealousy, bitter, angry, infatuated, obsessed, crying, fainting, lying, murdering, stealing, begging, drinking, scoffing, then feigning indifference, then doing it all over again, all within the span of a page. It's nuts. Now, this obviously touches upon a similar point to the first review in the first half of it, where it's talking about how the book takes a while to get going. But I wanted to focus on the second half, where they identify quite plausibly that Dostoevsky's characters don't quite act like real people. And I think this is broadly true. It's if anything, I think, kind of a strength of Dostoevsky's writing, though maybe that's because I'm not that much of a fan of realistic characters in literature. I don't tend to find realistic characters quite as engaging as these more exaggerated or heightened characters, I suppose. And Dostoevsky's characters are certainly exaggerated. There's this overriding theme that each of the characters in his novels will tend to represent some broader idea or some philosophy or way to approach life. So in the Brothers Karamazov, as we said, Alyosha represents this spiritual existence, which means for much of the book, with a few exceptions, he is almost superhumanly wonderful. And Dostoevsky even points this out. It's in his introduction to Alyosha's character, he says that Alyosha is almost supernaturally beloved by all. Likewise, Ivan represents this atheistic, in Dostoevsky's opinion, over-intellectualizing view on life. And as a result, he is tormented by ideas to the extent that not many people in real life are. But again, that allows Dostoevsky to use the character to give arguments and thoughts on a particular philosophy. I also think that it really heightens some of these scenes that otherwise could come across as quite dull. Even when there's nothing that's physically going on that seems that action-packed, or if a plot point hasn't hit for, a couple hundred pages maybe, there are still these characters experiencing these in-depth and dramatic emotional stakes, and that raises even the most trivial seeming of scenes into almost the realm of melodrama at points. But I mean that in a positive way. I don't mean melodrama in the sense of totally ridiculous and bordering on comical, though I think some people probably do have that experience when reading some of the scenes in the Brothers Karamazov. I mean that it takes ordinary life and puts this fantastic spin on it, while at the same time never actually breaking from some kind of realistic sheen. Like, whenever there are supernatural elements in Dostoevsky, they tend to at least be plausibly explained by other naturalistic things. Like, Ivan starts seeing the devil at one point in the Brothers Karamazov, but it could be explained by a fever or a hallucination, who knows? But I really am fond of the fantastic realism used by Dostoevsky in his character writing, which is a phrase that critics often use to describe his works. But yes, if you personally are more of a fan of down-to-earth stories, then perhaps this book isn't quite for you. Okay, next we have a review for Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and it reads, "World's worst writer produces another piece of garbage that will appeal to thickos whose favourite book is either Fight Club or American Psycho, because they think contrived writing full of deliberate idiot bait should be interpreted as meaningful literature. You've been had, you fools." I like the contrast in tone between calling the people that enjoy Blood Meridian thickos, and then the note of sympathy in warning them that they've been had and that they're being taken advantage of and that they are the fool in this situation. I'll have to disagree with this person's assessment of Blood Meridian. I agree that it's not for everyone, and I wouldn't class it among my favourite books. In fact, when I reread it to write my video on it, I really didn't enjoy the experience. I don't really like violence in literature. Like, I don't mind it in small doses, but in general, it's really not my kind of thing. I'm quite squeamish, to be honest. This is a thing that's changed since I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, I could sit through violent TV shows and I could watch violent movies and I could read violent books, and it just wouldn't faze me at all. And then I hit about 22, 23, and all of a sudden it would just gently start to bother me. Like, I would physically feel myself empathizing more with the characters who were suffering, and that kind of got me down. As a result, I probably read fewer books with violence in them than I used to, and I certainly don't watch much violent TV or violent film. But yes, I would say that there are definitely ideas in Blood Meridian that are worth exploring. There's this underlying Gnostic philosophy that underpins quite a lot of Cormac's work, but is especially prevalent here. I also think I would defend the violence in Blood Meridian as serving a purpose. It really does enhance the atmosphere of the novel. And again, I'm saying that as somebody who doesn't particularly enjoy reading about violence in novels. It really does place you in the mind of this roving gang of amoral, psychotic cowboys. And the interesting thing about the violence in Blood Meridian is you become more and more inured to it over the course of the novel, in much the same way that the kid does, right? So at the beginning of the novel, when we first see the kind of extreme violence that takes place in Blood Meridian, it really shocks you, right? You really think, oh, God, this is horrible. It emotionally impacts you, right? You see these horrible scenes being described and it gets to you. But then as the violence goes on, you kind of get used to it. And then by the end of the novel, some violent scene will be described and you'll just think, well, I mean, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, right? Now it just doesn't matter to me. I've read so many horrible atrocities over the past 300 odd pages that I'm just done, right? I can't feel anything in response to even the most horrific violence. And I think this sort of mirrors McCarthy's analysis of the Glanton gang, right? Where they gradually increase their barbarity over time because the barbarity they were enacting before no longer strikes them as particularly shocking. So they can just get that bit more shocking, and then that doesn't strike them as shocking. Then they get a bit more shocking. And before you know it, they're all being absolutely horrible people with very few redeeming qualities. And that can be a real slog to read, and some people hate it, but I think it makes a really effective point about the nature of violence and the psychology of committing increasingly evil acts that are normalized in your own mind. So no, I don't think this is idiot bait, and I do think that it constitutes meaningful literature. I sometimes think people can get so hung up on the shock factor involved in the violence that the underlying meaning and underlying effectiveness can get totally missed. Though, of course, this could constitute its own critique of McCarthy's work. If there is this underlying purpose to the violence, but it's coming across as gratuitous, has the message really hit home? I ultimately don't know. But I do think that the slightly condescending and almost angry tone taken by this review is a bit of a shame, but it does make for entertaining reading. So next we have two broadly unenthusiastic reviews of Stendhal's On Love, which, if you've been around the channel for any length of time, you'll know is one of my favourite books ever. So the first review just reads, I enjoyed Stendhal's other books, but this just seemed like the ravings of a pissed-off teenager. And the second review reads, this book is strictly speaking about infatuation and courtship. His theory of love, which he calls crystallization, is based on the stage of idealization of the other when everything about him or her seems perfect and doubt about the feelings of the other permeates the relationship. I don't think there is a word written in this book about long-term companionship. I pick these reviews partly because I actually sort of think that they may be onto something. As I say, this is one of my favorite books. I'm not bad-mouthing Stendhal. But I do think that both of them get to a core critique of the book that many raise against it, and I would also gently raise against it as well. There's a reason why my video covering the book is called Why Crushes Are So Painful, and not a kind of broader video about the nature of love or something like that. It's because Stendhal is largely concerned with the initial short-term stages of love, as this review says. It's about that moment where you feel head over heels for someone, but don't necessarily know them all that well. Stendhal talks a lot about how the image of the beloved can become aggrandized in your mind, and you become obsessed with that over the person themselves. And I think it's important to note that Stendhal's description of love is just that. It is descriptive of a certain stage of love where it is a bit more akin to infatuation. In fact, some psychologists use Stendhal's theory of love as the foundation for their theory of limerence, which is meant to be this kind of disordered, obsessive sort of love that often does crop up in the initial stages of getting to know someone, and you get to imagine that they're wonderful and will solve all your problems, and then you get with them and you find that that's not true, and this love has to mature into something a little bit more stable and a little bit less based on obsession and short-term emotional thrills. However, I do also think that's one reason why I really like the book, because it deals with this stage of love that most people, including myself, find sort of intensely embarrassing, right? You know, you find yourself thinking about another person in ways that are not appropriate at that stage of knowing them. You know, they occupy too much of your thought, you know, to put it gently. And I like the fact that Stendhal examines this with a sort of almost analytic philosophical lens. He's very good at breaking down his observations about this early stage of love in a systematic way that basically anyone can understand and most people can recognize. I think that a lot of works of philosophy about love, things like Plato's Symposium or the reflections of Michel de Montaigne about love and companionship, and indeed sort of 20th century views on love from people like Erich Fromm, right, where he talks about loving as a skill that you develop. And I think there's value to be had in all of these. But I do think that they tend to skirt over the more insane stages of early love with someone. So I like Stendhal because it reminds me of something like The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is by Johann von Goethe. which is about this kind of obsessed young man, someone who just can't get his beloved out of their head. And in Werther's case, this ends in just absolute disaster, which of course obsessive love often can. But I think that this sort of extreme obsessive love that can often end in tragedy and can lead to all sorts of ugly things is often present to a far lesser extent in your average person. I mean, who can say that they haven't done something embarrassing in this sort of, as I said, early stage of courtship, early stage of love? So this is one of those scenarios where I both sort of agree with these reviews. It does sometimes sound a bit like a pissed off teenager, and it doesn't deal with these deeper, long-term, companionate kinds of love. But I think that's part of what makes the work so valuable, because this isn't a topic that's treated much in this systematic way elsewhere. I think that Stendhal's On Love is still the most comprehensive and insightful treatment of this particular kind of love and affection that I have ever read. Okay, now for something completely different. We have a review of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, and this person really didn't like it. And it reads, "Place me firmly in the camp of Wittgenstein, builder of a mountain of gibberish. There is simply nothing remarkable or uniquely insightful of the human condition in this meaningless nonsense. A masterpiece? Of course not. The most important philosophical work of the 20th century? If so, we are all condemned to believe in unicorns and utopias." To a certain extent, I think this reviewer may have vastly overestimated the scope of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. For those of you that don't know, this is a posthumously published notebook of Ludwig Wittgenstein that he wrote in his later years. And it presents a picture of language that is far more functional than many philosophers at the time would give it credit for, essentially. And Wittgenstein was very interested in the different ways that people could use language and also the implicit rules of communication. So, say that you and I are having a discussion, there are kind of implicit things that we both agree to do and not do with regards to that discussion. A standard rule that's present in quite a lot of conversations is if you ask me a question and the question doesn't appear to be hostile or rude, then I'll do my best to answer that question. And there are loads of others. But essentially, that is one of the main linguistic points that Wittgenstein makes in the Philosophical Investigations. He also puts forward this idea of family resemblances to define terms. So take the term game, actually, is his example of this. Different games share certain properties, but also don't share numerous others, right? There's not much that Monopoly and hockey and chess and poker and solitaire all have in common. And, you can chuck video games in there now. But Wittgenstein thinks that we can nonetheless sensibly talk about games because while there's no necessary and sufficient set of conditions that can define a game, we can still notice the trends within how the term is used and construct a family resemblance between individual games. And thus this allows us to conveniently put them all under one label. So I think that when this person says that there's nothing remarkable or uniquely insightful of the human condition, I think that most people would probably agree, just because most people aren't nearly as hung up on issues of language as I and other philosophers are. When they call it meaningless nonsense, I would really like to push back on that, though, because I think that the functional analysis of language has proved incredibly influential. You won't get many people now saying, oh, yeah, language is just about semantic meaning and logical connections. No, most people do think in terms of the purposes language is used for. And I actually think that if more people understood the idea that there are diverse language games and that language is used for a myriad of different purposes, then they'd be able to make sense of dialogue and conversation and different types of conversation much more easily. We have a few different recognized language games in everyday speech. I mean, the classic thing that people ask is this serious or is this satire? But of course, there is a huge middle ground between those two camps. There's kind of outright satires like Voltaire's Candide, where it's very much ironically saying this is the best of all possible worlds, when really Voltaire means this is not the best of all possible worlds, and I'm going to show how ridiculous that proposition is. That's like a real full-blown satire, in contrast with Leibniz, who just put forward the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds and put it forward as a serious proposition. But there are things in the middle of this, right? So, for example, the BBC show Yes, Minister. I don't know if you've watched it. Please do if you haven't. It's absolutely hilarious. It's one of my favourite TV shows. But there, they make a satire of the practices of the British government. But it's a very different kind of satire to say what Voltaire does in Candide, because it's what I would call a semi-sympathetic satire. All of the main characters are members of the UK civil service or the government in some way. And although it heavily criticises these figures and what they do, it also shows the situations from their perspective. So while it's critiquing them, you're also, as the audience, implicitly rooting for one or more of them a fair amount of the time. Sometimes you're kind of outright against them, but quite a lot of the time, the relationship between the audience and the characters is a little bit more complicated than that. And that's a classic example of something that's not quite full satire and not a serious proposition, but something that lies between. And I think that we could do well to recognize these more nuanced styles of language game. Like being tongue-in-cheek is a kind of language game where you're not being super serious, but you're also not outright denying your statements. You might be saying, I believe this, but I recognize it's a bit silly. Or I recognize that something is false, but at the same time, I can see how people would believe it, and I'm not going to outright mock or condemn them. And there, you might not be able to say, as in the case of satire, that the speaker definitely doesn't believe the contents of their sentences, but you might not be able to say that they believe the whole contents of their sentences. They might just believe the general thrust or some underlying implication of their statements. So yeah, and I think that Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations just opens up this whole world of language analysis that previously I don't think was fully appreciated, at least not in the world of philosophy. So yes, I would gently push back on this person's analysis of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, but nonetheless, they're probably right that it's not the most important philosophical work of the 20th century, and they're probably also right that you won't discover some kind of groundbreaking analysis of the entire human condition here. This is first and foremost a work about language, and I love that. That's one of the reasons why I really like Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. But if you're not similarly obsessed with language, then it might not be for you. Though I would encourage an obsession with language. It is like the medium through which we communicate with one another and enmesh ourselves in the social fabrics that dictate and define and influence so much of our lives. So I don't know, maybe if you're not obsessed with language, get a bit more obsessed with language, man. It's fascinating. Next, we have a 1-star review for Max Stirner's book, The Ego and Its Own, or The Unique and Its Property, depending on which translation you prefer. And it reads, "This book is dangerous, and the ideas contained in it may impact my salvation. The worldview Stirner portrays is so absolutely pessimistic. It can be a useful book for understanding better the human condition, but the book is so horribly depressing." So, for those of you that don't know, Max Stirner's The Ego in Its Own is a book that promotes egoism. That is, the idea that in some way we do or should only care about ourselves. He criticizes moral ideals and religions as spooks, and he instead glorifies individual human agency. He's been very influential in anarchist thought, particularly on the more right-wing end of things, but also on the left. I think that the anarchist Emma Goldman was particularly influenced by Stirner, if I remember correctly. Don't pull me up on that. I don't know if I'm just misremembering things. But in either case, the reason I wanted to hone in on this review in particular is the phrase, "the ideas contained in it may impact my salvation." Because that's just not an attitude that you tend to get to books anymore, but it is an old one. The Catholic Church used to ban a whole host of books. Ban as in forbid Catholic readers from reading them, or Catholic publishers, I suppose, once the kind of Gutenberg press got started and all that sort of thing, from reproducing them. And their reasoning behind this was pretty straightforward. They thought that certain books would expose people to dangerous ideas. And not just dangerous in the sense of it might make them do things that were unhelpful to society. They thought it might impact their salvation. They thought it might put their soul at risk. For all I've criticized the banning of books in the past, I actually think that this reasoning is, in some sense, really taking ideas seriously. It is really taking books seriously. In some ways, it's a real mark of respect to a given idea or a given book, that you think that it can literally impact the scope of eternity. And this person is arguing within that tradition. The reason that he's condemning Stirner's book is that he thinks that it might damn him to hell. And I don't know, I think it's kind of, I don't know if charming's the right word, But I think that it reflects the fact that this reviewer is truly taking the ideas in Stirner's work seriously. And I think that in some ways, that is a real mark of respect. I also think that his point that the worldview Stirner portrays is quite pessimistic is shared by a great many who read Stirner's work. I think that most people, and I would probably count myself in this camp, do think that the part of Stirner's work where he actually positively advocates for egoism are perhaps less convincing than the parts where he is just criticizing the idea of a moral ideal or the idea of a supernaturally based religion or humanism or something like that. Like, he has some quite astute critiques as to how moral systems ought to ground themselves, as in he suspects that they can't ground themselves. But if you think that a moral system could ground itself, then it really raises questions as to how it might do so. And I think that kind of stuff is very philosophically interesting. I think that there are problems with his positive conception of egoism that I raise in my video on the topic, so I won't recap them here. But I also do think that people tend to have this emotional reaction to Stirner where they just find his philosophy depressing. And to a certain extent, I think that egoism as a philosophy doesn't quite do justice to how much we humans need one another. I don't think that Stirner, writing in the 19th century, can appreciate just how much humanity will be discovered to be a fundamentally social species. I think this goes for quite a lot of philosophers, to be honest. There's a tendency within philosophy to glorify the lone individual standing against the onslaught of the rest of society. And sometimes this is an entirely appropriate image, but sometimes I do think that it tends towards this extreme individualist picture of what it means to be human. I tend to lean towards a picture of the human mind that is slightly more mimetic and slightly more influenced by social factors around it. But nonetheless, I think that Stirner's work, and especially his critique of the concept of an ideal, is well worth reading. Though I just wanted to point this out as a review because I think that point about salvation, I don't know, it just resonated with something in me that was like, yeah, this guy's taking this book seriously. He truly thinks that it can impact his soul, and I like that. Next, we have an incredibly angry review of Franz Kafka's The Trial that reads, "What is this shit? I've read many reviews and saw that I belong to the minority who just didn't like or get this book. Like the author, I'm going to leave The Trial unfinished and surrender to the fact that, unfortunately, Franz Kafka's writing is way too bizarre, inane, and unrealistic for my tastes. The protagonist, a pretentious banker named Joseph K., woke up one morning to find two strangers in his room who told him that he was under arrest. The reason for his conviction is never revealed, and even the officers who came to deliver the news are uninformed. In the next chapters, we follow Kay in a series of encounters that are grounds for meaningless and empty discussion with various characters that seldom reappear throughout the story and don't seem to have an efficient role in the progress of the narrative. Kay's so-called quest to seek answers and vindicate his name turns out to be futile, as he never musters enough courage or audacity to extract definite answers, and instead allows his complacency to let him act in a way that harms him more than it helps him in his case. I especially loved how almost every female character seems to want him, which feeds his arrogance all the more." I love the tone of this review. It's furious, and, you know, I'm all for people getting very passionate about literature. So, yeah, I'm kind of... Yeah, I like it when people have these strong, intense reactions to novels and to literature. I would say that quite a lot of the things that this author picks up on, I don't think that Kafka would deny, right? Joseph K. isn't necessarily meant to be an extremely likable character. I think this is something that people quite often expect when going into a novel, that the lead character is going to be someone that you can unambiguously root for, or at the very least, they're going to be likable. But a lot of Kafka's protagonists just aren't. They are petty and often resentful, and the whole narrative becomes confusing and disorienting. But that is sort of the point. That's often what people go to Kafka for. I like reviews like this, because actually, in a lot of ways, they have described the story very accurately, but they have framed it in such a way that it is inherently a critique of the story, when, in fact, even this psychosexual element that they mention at the end is often praised as a strength of Kafka's work. Not necessarily that every female character throws themselves at the protagonist, because that often doesn't happen, but that you get to explore the character and Kafka's rather strange relationship with their own libido through the novel. But I do think people sometimes do this when they're reading a book, right? They they will notice something that they don't like, and they will implicitly assume that that is inherently a bad thing, and then call it shit, as this person's done here, as opposed to perhaps wondering that, viewed from a slightly different angle, these seeming flaws in the story might actually become strengths. Okay, next we have a review for Albert Camus' The Plague, and it reads as follows. It started strong. All the rats dying in increasing numbers, followed by a few people. A great plague story. Then some other characters were introduced. The tourist, the official, the crook, the priest, the journalist. Turns out, this plague story is really just an excuse to show how each one of these guys agonizes over some personal moral decision in dealing with the plague situation. Darn. So I sort of get this existential philosophy thing Camus is going for, which says you arrive at the truth not by reason and the semantics of words, but by the act of living your life. Now, you can't use reason. So to distinguish this philosophy from other flavors of bullshit, you write a story about people living their lives instead of explaining things clearly and logically. Fine. So how would people that you know react to a plague? The crook is happy because the cops stopped looking for him and is disappointed when the plague is over. I've known some crooks, and I guarantee they're going to be trying to get the hell out of Dodge. The journalist agonizes over slipping out past the guards because he misses his wife, not because he wants to escape horrible death, of course. Then, finally, decides to stay and help. Only people who spend all day sitting in a cafe and talking about existentialism think this is going to be the dilemma. Now, I can sort of see where this person is coming from, right? Maybe that's not how you would react in times of crisis. But Camus not pulling these observations out of nowhere. It's thought that many of the characters in The Plague are loosely inspired by how people in France reacted to the Nazi occupation. Here was a crisis upon the French nation and upon the French people, and people did face pretty intense moral dilemmas. They might have had to put their principles above their family, or some might have made the decision to put their own personal success well above their principles to oppose Hitler and his regime. I think this person may underestimate just how often tricky moral decisions crop up in a crisis. I mean, you can read people's memoirs about this if they've been through really horrific situations, like in Viktor Frankl's writing, or in the Gulag Archipelago, or really most writers that have gone through something truly horrific will have something to say about the tortuous moral decisions they had to make while in this desperate circumstance. I mean, you could even take a modern example that happens every day, right? You've got charity workers or doctors who are agonizing over which patient or which person to allocate scarce resources to, right? I think that far from moral decisions being mainly the purview of people sitting around in cafes, I think that moral decisions are often well within the realms of some people performing the most important jobs in the world and also suffering from the most extreme and barbaric circumstances in the world. I also just wanted to point out that this reviewer sort of really misunderstands Camus' philosophy. Camus holds that his absurdism, the idea that life has no meaning and we're kind of struggling to rebel against this lack of meaning, either collectively or individually, as in his earlier thought, he thinks that is primarily based on reason, right? You get this in the myth of Sisyphus. This reviewer seems to misunderstand this. He seems to suggest that Camus thinks you can't use reason in existentialist philosophy, and that's simply not the case. I wish I could soften the blow, but it just isn't. I also like this review because it's clearly drawing on the caricature of an existentialist philosopher, forgetting that quite a lot of the French existentialists fought and or resisted the literal Nazis at some point. So I think that they may be overestimating to what extent these people lived exclusively cushy lives. I think that people like Camus and Sartre probably were faced with pretty extreme moral decisions. And I think that regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with their philosophies, or even, agree or disagree with some of their moral decisions, especially maybe some of the ones of Sartre later in life where he signed some perhaps not overly cool documents, but let's not dwell on that. I think that you would have to admit that they did face moral dilemmas, and that actually in extreme situations, moral dilemmas do often crop up because morality is an almost ubiquitous part of the way that we make decisions and engage with the world, and desperate circumstances will raise the moral stakes somewhat. Right, that's all I have for you today. If you want to check out my last video on 1-star reviews of philosophical classics, you can find it right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.